Hey everybody, welcome to NWR TV. My name is John Reardon, and welcome back to another exciting, thrilling episode of Nintendo's Gamepads. Now, if you missed the first episode, I will put a link right there for you to click on. The first episode was all about Nintendo's color TV games, and while yes, they were primitive, they did eventually lead to one of the greatest inventions in the history of gaming, and that is where we're going to start today. If you look through the credits of games like Metroid and Kid Icarus, you'll often encounter the name Gunpei Yokoi. He was an incredibly gifted game designer, and he taught Miyamoto himself how to make games. While his name adorns many of Nintendo's finest games, his real passion seems to have been as an inventor, a toy maker. Most of Yokoi's work was limited to Nintendo's handhelds, which we'll discuss in another episode. His greatest work, however, would not only adorn Nintendo consoles, but the consoles of all of Nintendo's competitors to this very day. Yokoi's D-pad solved a huge problem that had plagued the first and second generation consoles. Until that point, the joystick was the go-to mechanism for interacting with a game. The problem with a joystick is that it's a very high-profile device, and so it's very easy to snap off if you get a little too excited while you're playing a game. While it was easy enough for arcade owners to get replacement joysticks, home console owners didn't have stockpiles of spare parts. Many companies didn't even sell extra controllers as replacements. The D-pad, on the other hand, is low profile, so it can't be snapped off like a joystick can. It was also made of a single piece of plastic, preventing any one part from getting stuck. Fewer moving parts means less opportunity for error. The D-pad's incredibly simple yet effective design has made it a staple on nearly every console since its invention. The D-pad premiered on Yokoi's first portable game system, the Game & Watch, more specifically, his version of Donkey Kong. But it wouldn't hit the mainstream until it graced the controller of Nintendo's third-generation home console, the NES, or the Famicom, as it's called in Japan. The NES controller took very strong influence from Yokoi's version of Donkey Kong. This design would also prove influential on a later line of Nintendo handhelds as well. The NES controller could be considered the first modern home console controller. A lot of home consoles at the time would try to emulate the arcade experience. The NES, on the other hand, completely redesigned the interface. The NES was a huge success, and for all intents and purposes, the sole member of the third-generation console race. The next generation wouldn't be so easy. From the ashes of decimation that the NES had wrought, rose a small company with a lot of ambition. Sega was setting their 16-bit sights on Nintendo. The Super Nintendo controller may look like a perfectly natural evolution of the NES controller, but if we take a look at Sega's controller, we can see that it's not. Sega's 8-bit console controller was a clear copy of Nintendo's. When Sega set about designing their 16-bit console, the Genesis, they started with that classic controller. Sega's answer for improving that controller was to add an extra button. The first two buttons were in a row, so logically the third should just be added onto the end. This is the natural evolution of the NES controller. What Nintendo did was completely different. Sega was right that the controller would need more buttons for the complex games that 16-bit would allow, but they were wrong about how to do it. One of the reasons that the D-pad had worked so well was that its low-profile, plush-shaped design had made it easy to roll your thumb around and access all of the directions quickly with very little movement. Nintendo realized that this same principle could also be applied to the other side of the controller. Rather than lining up all of their buttons as Sega had done, Nintendo placed them in a diamond formation. This allowed them to add two face buttons, X and Y, where Sega had only added one, C. Nintendo also thought of an entirely new form of button to add. By placing two shoulder buttons where a player's pointer fingers would naturally rest, Nintendo now had a total of 12 inputs on their controller compared to Sega's 8. While arguments still rage on today over whether the Genesis or the Super Nintendo was the better 16-bit console, I think it's clear that Nintendo had the better controller. Nintendo's next home console would face a challenge. Video games were moving from 2D side-scrollers to free-roaming 3D adventures. It was an exciting time, but it very quickly became evident that the controllers we had wouldn't work with these new 3D games. Gunpei Yokoi took a stab at the 3D dilemma, and while his dual-analog controller was ahead of its time in a lot of ways, it lacked the precision necessary for navigating in 3 dimensions. Once again, we're going to hear a lot more about Gunpei Yokoi in a later episode. When designing the controller for the Ultra 64, as it was called at the time, Nintendo had a list of things they knew they had to get right. Firstly, they didn't want to abandon 2D games. Who knew where the industry would take them, so it was best to keep all options open. Secondly, 3D games wouldn't have the lockdown cameras that 2D games did, and so the player would need some way to influence the camera's position, so they could take in the world from every angle. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the player needed to be able to move with the same amount of freedom they could in the real world. To solve the first problem, Nintendo decided they would include the essential inputs from the SNES controller, namely the D-pad. This would allow games to play just like they had in the old days. For the second issue, Nintendo would add another 2 buttons to their diamond. These new buttons would be the new A and B buttons, and would be responsible for most of the action. The original SNES Diamond would be renamed the C buttons, allowing players to move the camera in 4 directions. While officially the C stands for camera, I've always wondered if it was a little bit of a jab at Sega, essentially saying, this is how you do C buttons. To solve the third problem, Nintendo returned to the arcade days. They created a small, low-profile joystick that would be harder, though still not impossible, to break. This would allow for freedom of movement, along with alterable intensities. Lightly pushing the stick might cause a character to walk, while pushing it all the way to the end of its range could make a character run. But where to put it? Nintendo saw the NES and SNES controllers as essentially having 2 handles, one for the left hand and one for the right. The left hand controlled movement, and if Nintendo still wanted a D-pad on the new controller, they would need to leave it in the same place. Perhaps the answer could therefore be to add a third handle. The player could hold the controller differently to play 3D games and 2D games. And thus, the Tusks were born. This did create a problem, however. The L button was no longer positioned at the resting place of the pointer finger during 3D games. Now the pointer finger was wrapped around the center handle of the controller, as if it was holding a gun. And so, just like a gun, a trigger was added to the bottom of the central handle. This button would be called the Z button, and it would serve as a replacement for the L button during 3D games. The N64 controller was weird, but it worked, and it worked well. And as developers got better at making 3D games, they found that the player needed less control over the 3D camera, simply because they had gotten better at programming it. This freed up the C buttons to do even more, such as inventory slots in The Legend of Zelda. All in all, the N64 was adorned with a whopping 14 input methods, plus the nearly unlimited input variations taken from the joystick. Home console gaming was getting complicated, but those simple 8-bit graphics had not been abandoned. There was a whole other world of Nintendo games operating in the sidelines. As Yokoi's Game & Watch had influenced the NES, so too would other handhelds influence the future of Nintendo's controllers. From movement controls and touchscreens to dual-screen experiences, they all started on a very small scale. Thank you very much for watching. Be sure to subscribe to NWR TV, and also check out the huge amount of content over at NintendoWorldReport.com. And if you have some free time, you can also go subscribe to my YouTube channel, where I talk about Nintendo all day long. You can also follow me on Twitter at JTSKnight92, and keep up with all my random ramblings and whatnot. Once again, my name is John Reardon. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in episode 3 of our magical learning journey through the history of Nintendo's controller and button input devices. Or Nintendo's Gamepads is the real title. It is not the other thing. It is... We're still going with Nintendo's Gamepads. I like it. Alludes to the Wii U and yet also everything else. So that is the title we're going with. I'm just putting some buffer space at the end of the video so you'll click the subscribe button. And maybe some other links. That's all I'm doing. That's all I ever do. Okay. You have enough time? Okay. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.